He didn't stand up because he thought she needed saving. He stood up because nobody else would. Seat 14C, somewhere over the Rockies, 37,000 feet above the earth, and a grown man in a wrinkled plaid shirt was about to do something that would quietly unravel the next 6 months of both their lives. But we'll get to that. Hit the subscribe button, because before any of it makes sense, you have to understand who Sawyer Holt was before he ever stepped onto that plane, and who the woman in the navy blazer really was before she ever put it on. Sawyer Holt had the kind of hands that told a story before he ever opened his mouth. Calloused across the palm, a small scar along his right thumb from a table saw incident in 2019, nails always just slightly dirty no matter how hard he scrubbed them. He was 43 years old and had spent the last 20 of them in residential construction. First as a framer, then a foreman, then the reluctant owner of a small contracting outfit out of Denver, Colorado called Holt and Sons, which was a little misleading since he had no sons. Just one daughter, 9 years old, Penny. Penny Holt had her father's dark eyebrows and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking through something too big for her to say out loud. She was sitting beside Sawyer now in seat 14D, a window seat, watching the clouds roll below them with the focused reverence of someone seeing something sacred. She had a worn-out paperback in her lap, some fantasy novel about a girl who discovers she can hear trees, but she hadn't turned a page in 40 minutes. She was just watching the sky. This was only the third time Penny had been on an airplane. The first two she didn't remember. She was 3 and 5. This one she was going to remember. Sawyer had already made his peace with that. They were flying from Denver to Chicago for what Sawyer had told Penny was a meeting with some adults. That was true, in the same way that calling the Atlantic Ocean a puddle is technically not a lie. The meeting was a custody hearing. Sandra, Sawyer's ex-wife, Penny's mother, had filed a motion to relocate. She wanted to take Penny to Portland, Oregon, where her new fiancé had taken a job. Sawyer had been fighting it for 7 months. 7 months of legal fees that were slowly swallowing the savings he'd spent 15 years building. 7 months of phone calls with his lawyer, Warren, who always sounded just slightly less confident than he had the week before. Sawyer wasn't a dramatic man. He didn't catastrophize, didn't spiral, didn't let his voice crack when things got hard. He processed things in silence, the way concrete sets, slowly, quietly, until you realize it's solid. But that morning, standing in the Denver airport bathroom at 5:45 a.m., staring at himself in the fluorescent light, he had allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of honest fear. He let himself feel the full weight of the possibility that a judge might tell him, in 6 days, that he could see his daughter 4 times a year. He let that sit in his chest. And then he washed his hands, walked out, and bought Penny a hot chocolate at the airport cafe and didn't say a single word about any of it. That was Sawyer Holt. Now here he was 37,000 feet up, a paper cup of coffee going cold on his tray table, watching his daughter watch the clouds, thinking about whether he'd packed her purple hoodie, because she always ran cold on airplanes, and he couldn't remember if he'd. "Sir, can I get you anything else before we begin our beverage service?" He looked up. The flight attendant standing in the aisle had brown hair pulled back into a low ponytail, a few strands loose at her temples. She was wearing the standard Millionaire uniform, navy blazer, white blouse, a blue scarf tied at her collar. Her name tag said Elise. She was holding a small tray with plastic-wrapped snack bags, and she was looking at him with the polished, practiced attentiveness of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Except for one small thing. Just one. And Sawyer noticed it only because he was a man who paid attention to details. The kind of man who could walk into a half-frame house and spot immediately which wall wasn't plumb. Her hands. Her hands were wrong for this job. Not dirty, not rough, the opposite. Smooth skin, trimmed nails, a faint white line on her right index finger that looked like the ghost of a ring she used to wear. But more than that, there was something in the way she held the tray. Not effortlessly, the way people hold things they've held 1,000 times, but with a subtle, careful intention. Like she was thinking about holding it. "I'm good. Thank you," Sawyer said. She smiled and turned to Penny. "What about you, sweetheart? We've got apple juice or orange juice, and do you have the kind with the little foil top?" Penny asked very seriously. The woman blinked. Then the corners of her eyes softened into something genuine. "I believe we do, yeah." "The Martinellis?" "Yes, that one." Penny nodded like a small executive approving a proposal. "Coming right up." The woman, Elise, moved down the aisle. Sawyer watched her go for just a second longer than he meant to, then went back to his cold coffee. He didn't think about her again for another 40 minutes. What Sawyer didn't know, what nobody on that plane knew, was that the woman with the ponytail and the navy blazer and the Martinelli's apple juice was Elise Tatum. As in the Elise Tatum. As in the founder and CEO of Tatum Logistics Group, a supply chain and freight management company headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, with operations in 11 states, a workforce of just over 4,000 employees, and a market valuation that had touched $2.3 billion the previous spring before a bad quarter knocked it back to a still staggering 1.8. As in the woman who had been on the cover of Supply Chain Quarterly twice, who had been named to Forbes' list of America's most powerful self-made women 3 years running, who had once turned down a dinner invitation from the Secretary of Commerce because she had a board meeting in the morning and she wasn't going to reschedule it for anyone. She was 38 years old, and she had been undercover on Meridian Air Flight 2247, Denver to Chicago, for approximately 3 hours and 47 minutes. It had been her idea. Of course it had been her idea. 6 weeks earlier, Tatum Logistics had released its annual employee satisfaction survey. The results had come back, and they were the worst in the company's 11-year history. Frontline workers, the people actually doing the hands-on jobs, the drivers, the warehouse managers, the customer-facing staff, had rated their overall job satisfaction at a 4.2 out of 10. 4.2. Elise had read the report 3 times in one sitting, sitting at her desk on the 32nd floor of Tatum Tower, and each time the number hit her the same way. Not with anger, with something closer to grief. Tatum Logistics had started as a 2-truck freight operation out of a storage unit in Aurora, Illinois. She had driven one of those trucks herself for the first 18 months. She had worked every job in that company at some point. She thought she understood, viscerally and bone deep, what it was to be a frontline employee. But the survey said otherwise. The survey said her people were disengaged, undervalued, and that management, meaning the layers between her and them, was failing them in ways the numbers couldn't fully articulate. So she did what Elise Tatum always did when she didn't understand something. She went to find out for herself. The Meridian Air partnership was a natural fit. Tatum Logistics had a major freight contract with Meridian, and Elise had quietly reached out to their COO, a man named Greg Callister, who owed her a rather significant professional favor, and arranged to spend 2 weeks embedded as a flight attendant on short-haul routes out of Denver. She told a total of 3 people, her head of HR, her personal assistant, and Greg Callister. Her board didn't know. Her executive team didn't know. The 4,000 employees of Tatum Logistics definitely didn't know. She had done this, in part, to understand the Meridian frontline operation, because if her freight partners were struggling, it affected her too. But mostly she'd done it to feel what it was like again. To remember what it was to be the person in the uniform, the person who gets snapped at overseas assignments and has a coffee spilled on them and gets looked through like furniture by a man in a business suit who can't be bothered to say thank you. For 7 days, she had served drinks and checked seat belts and smiled through headaches and felt the specific, grinding fatigue of a job that demands emotional performance at the same time it demands physical labor. She had learned things you couldn't learn from a boardroom. She had already, quietly, started composing a 12-point internal reform document in her head, which she would begin writing the day she came back. She was, by any measure, doing exactly what she had set out to do. And in seat 22, it happened. His name, she would later learn, was Brad Fenton. 54 years old, venture capital, based in Denver, but frequently traveling to Chicago for deals. He had flown Meridian Air enough times to know which flight attendants he could push and which he couldn't, and from the moment he'd boarded the plane, he had been working out which category Elise fell into. She had served him a scotch 40 minutes into the flight without issue. Routine. He'd barely looked at her. Then, 20 minutes later, he'd pressed the call button, and when she arrived at his row, he had looked at his glass and then looked at her with an expression she recognized immediately. The expression of a man who has decided, preemptively, to be dissatisfied. "This is warm," he said. She looked at the glass. There were still ice cubes in it. "I can get you a fresh one with more ice, sir." "Absolutely. I don't want more ice. I want the temperature to be right." "Is that something Meridian trains you to do? Or is that above your pay grade?" Elise felt the words land, felt the old reflex rise up. The one that would have, on the 32nd floor of Tatum Tower, produced a very quiet and very final kind of response. But she was Elise from her name tag right now, not Elise Tatum of anything. So she kept the smile in place. "I'll have a fresh one to you right away, sir." She had made it 3 steps down the aisle when she heard him say, not quite under his breath, not quite loud enough to be addressed, "These people really do hire anyone these days." She stopped walking. She didn't turn around. She stood very still in the aisle for 1, 2, 3 seconds, staring at the midsection of the plane, doing the mental math that every person who has ever worked a service job knows how to do in their sleep. The math of whether it is worth it. Whether this particular battle, at this particular moment, costs more than it's worth. She turned around, a fresh smile loaded and ready, and found that she didn't need to say anything. Because the man in seat 14C, the one with the plaid shirt and the cold coffee and the daughter who liked Martinelli's juice, was turned around in his seat, looking at Brad Fenton with an expression that was not angry. Exactly. It was something steadier than angry. Quieter. The kind of expression that sits in the room long after an angry expression would have dissipated. "I'm sorry," Sawyer Holt said, and his voice was perfectly even. "I think you might have said something you didn't mean to say out loud." Brad Fenton looked at him the way men who are accustomed to having rooms defer to them look at anyone who doesn't. "Excuse me," I said. Sawyer didn't raise his voice, didn't shift his posture, just kept that same steady regard. "I think you meant to say that out loud only to yourself, because I can't imagine a man your age actually believes it's acceptable to talk about a person who's trying to do her job like she isn't standing right there." The cabin had gone 1 degree quieter, not silent. The engine noise was constant, but the particular noise of humans pretending not to listen had settled over the nearby rows. Brad Fenton looked at Sawyer with the specific displeasure of a man who doesn't get challenged and doesn't know exactly how to respond to it. "Mind your own business. My daughter's right here," Sawyer said, with a brief, unhurried tilt of his head toward Penny, who was watching all of this over the top of her book with wide, intensely focused eyes. "I'd like her to understand what it looks like when someone speaks respectfully to another person. You're helping me with that lesson, one way or another." Silence. Not complete silence, but the kind where everyone in a 6-row radius is very deliberately looking at their phones. Brad Fenton made a small, contemptuous sound and turned back to his window. Sawyer turned back around. He picked up his cold coffee, took a sip, and went back to looking at nothing in particular. Penny stared at her father for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, "Good job, Daddy." Sawyer made a low sound in his throat that might have been a laugh if it had a little more air in it. And here's where things start to get interesting. Because Elise Tatum had worked 7 days undercover by that point, and in those 7 days, she had watched dozens of passengers interact with the crew around her, and not once had anyone done what that man in 14C had just done. Not once had a passenger turned around and quietly, calmly, non-theatrically stepped in. No raised voice. No desire for applause. He'd said his piece and gone back to his coffee, like it was simply a thing that needed doing. She finished making Brad Fennon's drink. She did it because she was a professional, because it was her job, and she brought it back to him without a word and walked away. And as she passed row 14, she slowed just slightly. "Thank you," she said. Low, just for him. Sawyer glanced up. "Don't thank me. I just talked to a man." Still, he nodded once, and she moved on. And that was almost the whole story. That almost could have been it. A small human moment at 37,000 feet, cataloged and forgotten before the landing gear went down. Almost. But Penny Holt, 9 years old, had the same instinct for connection that her father had, just with far fewer defenses around it. And when Elise came back through the cabin with a second round of beverage service, Penny looked up from her book and said, with the directness of children who haven't learned yet to be roundabout, "How come you look sad when you think nobody's looking?" Sawyer closed his eyes briefly. "Penny." "No, it's a real question," Penny insisted. "She looks like you when you think I'm asleep." Elise stood in the aisle, tray in hand, and she let out a breath that was almost a laugh and was also absolutely not. "You're very observant," she said. "My dad says that too. Your dad seems pretty perceptive himself." Penny beamed. "He is. He's good at noticing things. He noticed when our neighbor's porch was going to fall off before it fell off." Elise smiled at Sawyer. He had the specific expression of a man whose child is embarrassing him in a way he privately finds endearing. "That's a useful skill," she said. "What do you do when you're not doing this?" Penny asked, with the casual, omnivorous curiosity of a third grader. "Penny," Sawyer said, "people don't always want to talk about." "No, it's okay." Elise set her tray on a vacant seat beside them and crouched slightly, putting herself at a more conversational angle. "I work with a lot of people. I'm kind of studying how things get done, how people work together." She kept it vague. It was her practice line for the past week. Penny considered this. Like a scientist? Kind of like a scientist. My dad studies things too. He studied me when I was sick last year and figured out I was dehydrated before the doctor did. "Is that right?" Elise said, and she looked at Sawyer with something briefly unguarded in her eyes. "She had a bad stomach flu," Sawyer said, with the matter-of-factness of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by the things he does for his kid because he simply considers them baseline obligations of parenthood. She was flagging. "It wasn't complicated. He slept on my floor for 3 nights, Penny added. Sawyer looked at the seat back in front of him. Elise was quiet for just a moment too long. There was something happening in her expression that wasn't performance, a brief, private settling. Like someone who had forgotten a room could feel a certain temperature and just walked into it by accident. She recovered professionally, stood back up, picked up her tray. "Well," she said, "the scientist will let you two get back to it." She looked at Penny. "Finish your book?" "I already know how it ends," Penny said. "Then why are you reading it?" Penny thought about this with genuine seriousness. "Because the ending isn't the point." Elise looked at this 9-year-old child for a moment. "You know," she said softly, "I'm going to be thinking about that for a while." She moved down the aisle. And this time, Sawyer watched her go a little longer. There was something about her. He couldn't name it. He wasn't particularly given to analyzing such things, but there was a quality of compression to her, like a person who was used to taking up a certain kind of space and was deliberately, carefully making themselves smaller. He'd seen it before. usually in people who had something to prove to themselves or something to hide from everyone else. He told himself it was none of his business and picked up his cold coffee. But here's what you should know, sitting here watching this story from the outside. Something about that exchange had shifted the temperature in the cabin, just barely. And both of them felt it, and neither of them said so. And that gap between feeling something and saying it is where half of every important story lives. The descent into O'Hare began 45 minutes later. The seatbelt sign came on with its familiar soft chime, and the cabin went through the ritual compression of tray tables and window shades and carry-on bags. Sawyer helped Penny with her backpack. He tucked her book into the outer pocket with the careful economy of a person who has packed school bags so many times his hands do it automatically. He was stowing his own bag in the overhead when Brad Fenton stood up 4 rows back. In the chaos of deplaning preparation, the rustling, the standing, the slow accordion collapse of 100 people trying to get somewhere, Brad Fenton managed to position himself in the aisle directly behind Sawyer. And in a voice low enough not to carry but sharp enough to be intended, he said, "I hope whatever you're flying to Chicago for goes as badly as it can possibly go." Sawyer went very still. He didn't turn around. He stood there with his hands still on the overhead compartment, and Penny was right there, her backpack on, watching her father's back, and Sawyer took exactly 4 seconds to make a decision. Then he closed the compartment gently, let his hand come down, turned to Penny and said, "Grab your juice, babe," in the most even voice she had ever heard from him. Then he moved into the aisle, and he looked at Brad Fenton with that same still expression from earlier. Not angry, not theatrical, just completely, totally present in a way that is genuinely unsettling to people who aren't used to being looked at honestly. "Have a safe trip," Sawyer said. That was it. That was all he said. And something in the way he said it, the complete absence of performance, the total lack of need for the moment to go any particular way, made Brad Fenton look away first. Sawyer moved back to his row, took Penny's hand, and waited for the jetway to connect. Down the aisle, partially obscured by a service curtain, Elise Tatum had heard every word of it. She stood completely still, holding a stack of used plastic cups, and watched Sawyer Holt stand in the aisle of a commercial aircraft with his daughter's hand in his and an expression like bedrock, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time and was not prepared to name. They went their separate ways on the jetway. That's how these things usually end. Elise had a black car waiting on the lower level. She had kept her cover only through the jetway, after which she'd changed in a staff corridor, and her assistant had met her curbside with a press coat, her phone, which had 47 notifications on it, and a salted caramel latte because Patricia knew Elise didn't ask for things, but she always needed the latte. She'd put on the coat and scrolled through the notifications in the back of the car, and the first 11 had to do with something she was not ready to deal with, even on a good day. Preston Alt. Preston Alt was 61 years old, the chairman of Alt Capital Partners, and he had been quietly and persistently trying to acquire a controlling interest in Tatum Logistics Group for the better part of 14 months. He was methodical about it the way a water leak is methodical. Not dramatic, not explosive, just steady and persistent and appearing in places you hadn't checked. He'd been buying up minority stake positions through shell funds, lobbying Elise's board members in private conversations, and most recently, using her 2-week absence, which he had learned about through sources she had yet to identify, to accelerate a narrative among institutional shareholders that Elise Tatum was unstable, distracted, and unsuitable to lead the company through its current restructuring. The 11 notifications included a Wall Street Journal alert about Alt Capital Partners expressing interest in a strategic restructuring of TLG, language she recognized as acquisition code, 2 missed calls from her lead board member, a text from her general counsel that simply said, "Call me when you land," and a Google alert for her own name that pulled up an anonymous financial blog post with the headline, "Where's Elise Tatum? And should TLG shareholders be worried?" She read all of it in the car. Then she put her phone face down on the seat beside her and looked out the window at the gray Chicago afternoon for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked the phone back up and started making calls. She did not think about the man in the plaid shirt for the rest of that day. She thought about him at 11:47 that night, when she was sitting at her desk on the 32nd floor with a half-eaten sandwich and a legal pad covered in notes, and her mind drifted briefly and without permission to the image of him in the aisle, hand on the overhead compartment for seconds of stillness, and then have a safe trip, the complete absence of performance. She pressed that thought back down. She had a company to save. But here's the thing about thoughts you press down. They don't go away. They go underground. And underground is where they get their strength. Sawyer and Penny had checked into a mid-range hotel near the Loop by 8 that evening. The custody hearing wasn't until Friday. They had 2 days. He'd done this deliberately, partly to let Penny have some Chicago time. The Bean, the aquarium, maybe Navy Pier, and partly because he hadn't been sleeping well, and a 1,400-mile plane trip felt like something he needed to decompress from. Warren, his lawyer, had called on the drive from the airport. The opposing counsel had filed 2 additional motions that morning, adding complexity to what had already been complex. Warren's voice on the phone had that particular careful cadence of a man who wants to be honest, but is also managing someone's hope. And Sawyer had listened to all of it from the back seat while Penny had her nose pressed to the taxi window, watching Chicago slide by. "What are our odds, Warren?" A pause. "I wouldn't put numbers on it," which meant Warren wasn't confident. Sawyer knew the language. He learned to read it in the past 7 months the way you learn to read weather. "Okay," Sawyer said. "We're going to do everything we can, Sawyer." "I know you are." He didn't say anything else, and they hung up, and Penny turned from the window and said, "Was that about the meeting with the adults?" "Yeah," Sawyer said. "How'd you know? You sound different when it's about that." He looked at his daughter. Sometimes he forgot how old 9 was. "How do I sound?" She thought about it. Like when a project at work isn't going right, but you're not ready to say so yet. Sawyer had no answer for that. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they watched the city go by through the taxi window, and neither of them said anything, which was one of the ways they were exactly alike. That night, after Penny was asleep in her bed, he always let her have the actual bed. He took the pull-out or the cot or whatever the room offered. Sawyer sat in the desk chair by the window with his boots off and a glass of water and the quiet, specific weight of a person who is doing everything right and might still lose. He wasn't a man who asked for much from life. He had never wanted to be wealthy or famous or impressive. He had wanted to build things that lasted and to raise his daughter with enough steadiness around her that she would know how to handle whatever came her way. That was the full scope of his ambition. That was the whole wish. And the thought of seeing her 4 times a year, he stopped himself, pressed it back down. He looked out at the Chicago skyline, at the lights in those impossible towers, all those windows, all those lives stacked on top of each other. And he thought briefly and without knowing why about the woman on the plane, about the way she'd gone still when Penny said, "You look sad when you think nobody's looking." About the way she'd looked when Penny said the ending isn't the point. Like someone who had been running fast for a long time and had just heard, unexpectedly, something true. He didn't know her name. He hadn't thought to ask. She was gone into Chicago, and he was here in this hotel room with a pull-out couch and his cold water and 5 days until a judge decided something irreversible. He was asleep by midnight. He had one dream. He was on the plane again, but it was empty, just him and the clouds out the window, and the flight attendant with the wrong hands was walking down the aisle toward him, and just before she reached his row, the plane tilted, and the clouds came up like a wall, and he woke up in the pull-out couch at 3:47 a.m., heart steady, room dark, and he lay there listening to Penny breathe across the room until sleep found him again. He was asleep by 4. He ran into her on Wednesday. Not on a plane. Not by design. In the lobby of the Chicago Riverwalk Hotel, of all places, a mid to upscale property on the river, the kind of place that had good coffee in the lobby and a concierge who actually made eye contact. Sawyer and Penny had come off the Riverwalk because Penny had announced she needed a bathroom and also hot chocolate from a real place, not a machine, and the hotel lobby had seemed like the obvious answer. They were standing at the lobby coffee counter, Penny inspecting the pastry case with the thoroughness of a quality control inspector, when Sawyer heard a voice across the marble lobby that he recognized before he consciously understood why. He looked up. She was in a different kind of uniform now. A charcoal blazer, tailored a white blouse, dark slacks, a leather tote over one shoulder, phone to her ear, walking with the specific velocity of someone who has somewhere to be in approximately 6 minutes to get there. Her hair was down now, not pulled back, and it changed her face somewhat, made her look less contained, more like herself, whatever that meant. She passed within 10 feet of him without seeing him. "Hey," Sawyer said. She stopped, turned, blinked, and in the brief, unguarded moment before her expression caught up with the situation, he saw something cross her face that was almost, not quite, but almost relief. "You," she said. "Me," he agreed. He looked at her clothes. The blazer, the tote, the purposeful shoes. Day off from the airline. A microsecond of hesitation. Something like that. "You're staying here?" "God, no," he said, with a slight warmth in his voice. Penny needed a bathroom, and apparently this hotel has acceptable pastry. From beside the pastry case, Penny looked up and confirmed, "It does." Elise looked at the child, and her whole face did something complicated. Then she looked back at Sawyer. She had about 4 minutes before she needed to be upstairs, where she had a conference call with her general counsel about a countermotion regarding the alt capital moves. She was precisely on the timeline she needed to be on. "I'm glad I ran into you," she said, and meant it in a way she hadn't fully sorted out yet. "I wanted to say what you did on the plane. You already thanked me. I know. This is different." He studied her for a moment. "Different how?" She exhaled. This was not a conversation she had time for right now. "I've been working in a service role for the past week. And in that entire week, no one has done what you did. Somebody had to. That's not how it works," she said, with a directness that was slightly different from her in-flight manner. Slightly less managed. "That's not, in reality, how it works. Most people keep their heads down. You didn't, and you had your daughter with you, which made it," she stopped herself. "Anyway, I am grateful." Sawyer was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who listens to the whole thing before deciding what to do with it. "He was rude to you," Sawyer said simply. "My dad had a saying. He used to say, the only thing that gives a bully permission is silence. Once you stop giving it, the permission goes away." Elise looked at him for a beat too long. "That's a good saying," she said finally. "He was a good man." She nodded slowly. "Then, are you in Chicago for long?" "Through Friday. Then back to Denver." "What brings you here if you don't mind?" "Custody hearing," he said, and he said it the way he said most true things, without preamble or apology, just the fact, offered plainly. "My ex-wife wants to relocate with my daughter. I'm contesting it." Something shifted in Elise's expression. "I'm sorry." "Yeah," Sawyer said. "Me too." Penny had materialized at her father's elbow with a pane o' chocolate and was looking at Elise with frank, guileless recognition. "You're the flight attendant," she said. "I was," Elise said. "Today I'm something else." "What?" "Just a person in a lobby," Elise said, and smiled in a way that reached her eyes. Penny seemed to find this acceptable. She bit her pastry. Elise looked at Sawyer one more time. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at it. Her counsel. She had to go. She absolutely had to go. Good luck on Friday, she said. Thank you. She walked to the elevator bank. Sawyer watched her go. Something about the blazer, the tote, the way she moved in this lobby as though it belonged to her, or she to it. Not like a person who worked in it, but like a person who inhabited such spaces naturally by long experience. She had walked differently from the plane. Longer stride, taller somehow. He had built enough houses to know when something wasn't quite matching the plans. He filed it and let it go. Ready? He asked Penny. She's pretty, Penny said to her pain o' chocolate. Let's go, Sawyer said, and took his daughter's hand. The Friday hearing went badly. Not catastrophically. Warren had been good, genuinely good, had argued Sawyer's case with real conviction, but opposing counsel had brought in a child psychologist who testified about Penny's developmental need for consistent maternal presence. And the judge, a measured, silver-haired woman named Judge Carol Priestley, who had heard 10,000 custody cases and had the patient eyes to prove it, had listened to all of it with the careful neutrality that was, Sawyer knew, its own kind of signal. At the end of the day, Judge Priestley had announced she was taking the matter under advisement and would issue her ruling within 30 days. 30 days. A month of waiting, a month of not knowing. Sawyer and Penny flew home to Denver on Saturday morning. He watched the Chicago skyline recede below them on departure and let himself feel the fear for another 30 seconds and then pressed it down and asked the flight attendant, a cheerful young man named Kevin with a Pittsburgh Steelers pin on his lapel, if he could get a Martinelli's for his daughter. He kept busy. That was his method. He threw himself into a kitchen renovation in Englewood. The homeowners were a young couple who had bought a 1940s bungalow and wanted the kitchen modernized without losing the old character, which was exactly the kind of problem Sawyer found genuinely enjoyable. He worked long days. He came home and made Penny dinner and helped her with her homework and listened to her tell him about her day in the detailed, non-linear way of children, where the most important thing always arrives 4 anecdotes in unexpected. He did not think about Elise. He thought about Elise occasionally. Mostly he didn't. And then, on a Thursday morning, 16 days after the hearing, his phone rang with a Chicago area code he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He was in the middle of measuring a countertop. He answered, "Is this Sawyer Holt?" He didn't recognize the voice. Female, precise, professional. Who's asking? My name is Patricia Lund. I'm a personal assistant. My employer would like to speak with you, if you have a moment. Sawyer set down his tape measure. Who's your employer? A beat. Her name is Elise Tatum. He drove to Denver's Marriott downtown that same afternoon. Patricia had told him Elise was in town for a conference and could meet him at 4. He spent the drive trying to work out what in the world this was about. He came up mostly blank. She was in the lobby bar when he arrived, at a corner table, a glass of sparkling water in front of her. The charcoal blazer again, or one just like it. Hair down. She stood when he walked in, which was a gesture he hadn't expected, and he filed that detail somewhere. Thanks for coming, she said. I was curious. He sat. How did you get my number? I want to tell you something honestly, before we talk about anything else, she said, because I think you're a person who would want it that way. He looked at her steadily. Okay. She took a breath. I'm not a flight attendant. The room held still. I was working undercover, she continued. I embedded myself in the Meridian Air Crew for 2 weeks to study frontline employee experience. It's research I was doing for my company. She reached in her bag and set a business card on the table, and she slid it toward him. He picked it up. Elise Tatum, founder and CEO, Tatum Logistics Group. He looked at the card for a moment, looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not shock exactly, more like a man who has suspected a load-bearing wall is in the wrong place and has just confirmed it. Okay, he said. She blinked. That's your reaction. I knew something was off, he said. Didn't know what. Now I know. He set the card down. Why are you telling me? Because I found out about your hearing, she said. And I want to help, if you'll let me. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence, the kind that is doing a lot of work. How did you find out about my hearing? His voice was even, but it had something in it. I had someone do some research. You had someone look into me. Yes. She didn't flinch from it. I know that's an intrusion. I know it sounds strange. I'm not pretending otherwise. But I had a reason, and I'd like to explain it to you. And you can tell me to leave you alone after that, and I will. He was quiet. He looked at her. He looked at the card. He picked up the water a busboy had placed in front of him without his asking and took a sip. Explain, he said. She told him everything. The undercover research. What Brad Finnan had said in the aisle. What she'd seen in Sawyer when he'd stepped in. Not just the act, but the way of it. The quiet. The economy. The fact that his first instinct had been to think about what lesson his daughter was watching, not about how he looked. She told him she had thought about that on the flight back, and then again at her desk at 11:47 that night, and then again when she saw him in the hotel lobby, and then again and again in the 16 days since they'd been back in their respective lives. She told him she had people, legal people, good ones, people who work family law and New Chicago courts. And she had looked at his case summary, and she believed with some additional resources, the outcome could be different. I'm not trying to buy anything, she said, and she said it with her eyes steady on his. And he believed her, which surprised him, given the circumstances. I'm not trying to make a debt. She stopped. You did a good thing for a stranger. And I'm in a position to do a good thing back. And the good thing has stakes, real ones for your daughter. So here I am. Sawyer sat with it. He was a man who did not accept things easily. Not charity, not help, not the notion that someone was doing something for him without an angle. Life had not, on balance, suggested that things worked that way. He had built everything he had, the company, the house, the life, through his own labor and judgment, and he had learned to trust that above almost anything else. But he also believed in being honest with himself. And honest with himself meant acknowledging that Warren had told him his odds were not good. Honest with himself meant that Penny, right now, believed fully and completely that she was coming home to Denver when school let out in June, and that the thought of telling her otherwise was a thing he had practiced in his head and could not get through cleanly, not even in practice. What would this look like, he asked. Elise told him. A specialist in family law relocation cases out of her firm's Chicago retainer. Someone who had handled exactly this kind of motion in front of exactly this kind of judge and knew the procedural angles. A child development consultant who could counter the testimony from the hearing. All of it documented, all of it legitimate, all of it something she could arrange within the week. And what do you want in return? He asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Nothing you don't want to give. That's not an answer. It's the most honest answer I have. She held his gaze. I might want to have dinner sometime. That's all. The corner of his mouth did something involuntary. You're a billionaire and you're asking me to dinner. I'm a person with a complicated job who ran into a man in an airplane who impressed her, she said. The balance sheet is separate. Sawyer was quiet for a moment. Then, 1.8 billion. I looked you up too. She smiled. It was a real one. The kind he'd caught glimpses of on the plane, but never fully. When you walked out of that hotel lobby like you own the building. I don't own the building. You walked like you might. She laughed. It was brief and genuine and slightly surprised, like a sound that got out before she could manage it. Sawyer looked at his water glass. My daughter likes you, he said, which is notable. She has standards. She said the ending isn't the point, Elise said. She's 9. She's got everyone beat. Sawyer nodded slowly. The whole shape of it was settling in him. Not with suspicion anymore, but with the careful steadiness he brought to every load-bearing decision. He thought about Penny asleep in her bed at his sister's house right now. He thought about the 30-day clock and 24 days left on it. "I'll take the help," he said. And for the record, he looked at her directly. "I'm not good at pretending things are different than they are. I'm going to need you to be honest with me about everything. The case, the dinner, all of it. No games." "I don't play games," she said. "I used to. I'm done with it." He believed her again. He noted that he kept believing her, and he noted that it didn't make him nervous anymore. What came next was not a movie montage. It was a lot of work. The attorney Elise connected him with a sharp, compact woman named Dana Ferris with 20 years in family relocation law, reviewed the case, and found 3 procedural gaps in the opposing motion that Warren had not had the specialized experience to identify. She filed supplementary motions within 48 hours of being retained. The child development consultant she brought in, a man named Dr. Paul Scherer, who had published more academic papers on relocation impact than most family court judges had read, countered the earlier psychological testimony with a comprehensive report on Penny's established community ties, academic consistency, and documented relationship patterns with her father. And Elise herself? Elise stayed out of it. Completely. She did not call Warren, did not contact the opposing side, did not use her name or her money as leverage in any direction. She made the connections, and she stepped back. She had been very clear about this with Dana and Paul. "This is about the kid and the dad. My name goes nowhere near this." Sawyer had called her on a Sunday evening, 10 days after their lobby bar meeting, to report what Dana had told him about the new filings. "She thinks it changes the picture," he said. "Not guarantees, but changes." "Dana's good," Elise said. "Yeah." A pause. "Thank you. Again. I know I'm going to be saying that a lot. You don't have to say it at all. I was raised to say thank you." "That tracks," she said. "I wanted to ask you something," Sawyer said. "Yeah. How's your company? Whatever it is that's going on with it. The acquisition thing." She went quiet for a moment. "You looked into that too," she said. "You had someone look into my custody case," he said. "Seems fair." She laughed again. That same brief, unguarded sound. "It's complicated. I have time." She told him about Preston Alt, the slow accumulation of stake positions, the board pressure, the orchestrated narrative about her instability. She told it cleanly, without drama, the way she talked about most things as a set of facts to be analyzed and addressed. But underneath the clean recitation, Sawyer could hear something he recognized. The specific register of a person who is managing a fear they haven't fully admitted to themselves yet. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. "I'm going to face him down at the next board meeting," she said. "I've spent the past week rebuilding my shareholder narrative. Patricia has been scheduling one-on-one calls with every institutional investor. I'm presenting a 10-point operational renewal plan. I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Sawyer said. Silence. A different kind of silence than before, comfortable in a way that snuck up on them. "How's Penny?" Elise asked. "She asked me this morning if the flight attendant was going to come visit," Sawyer said. "A beat. What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know," which was honest. "The answer might be yes," Elise said, "if the offer's still on the table." "The offer's still on the table," Sawyer said. The board meeting that Elise had been preparing for was scheduled for the last Tuesday of the month, and it was, by any professional measure, a high-wire act. Preston Alt had secured enough board sympathy to put a vote on the agenda, a non-binding resolution expressing concern about executive leadership continuity, which was corporate language for we're considering nudging her out. He'd arrived at the meeting with 2 lawyers, which was itself a message. Elise had arrived with the presentation. She had spent 72 hours building the case, not just the numbers, which are defensible even in the bad quarter, but the story behind the numbers. The undercover research, the 12-point employee reform plan, the specific operational changes she was implementing immediately with timelines and projected impact. She stood at the head of the table, and she talked for 40 minutes without notes because she knew every syllable of it, and she needed them to see that. She talked about the 4,000 people who worked for Tatum Logistics. She talked about what she had learned by working alongside them, without naming the operation specifically, about the gap between executive perception and frontline reality. She talked about what it cost a company in efficiency and turnover and customer satisfaction when the people doing the actual work felt invisible. And then she looked at Preston Alt directly and said, I founded this company. I drove one of its trucks. I know what this company is because I built it from nothing, and I know what it needs because I went and found out. If there's a board member here who believes Preston Alt can walk in and understand this company the way I do, I'm happy to hear that argument made in plain language. Preston Alt made the argument in plain language. It was not compelling. The non-binding resolution failed. 7-4. Elise walked out of Tatum Tower that evening into a cold Chicago October and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, letting the air do what air does when you've been in a closed room under pressure for 4 hours. She called Patricia and told her she was taking the rest of the evening off. Patricia, who was accustomed to this meaning I'll be back in an hour, was pleasantly astonished when Elise followed through. She called Sawyer from the cab home. It went well, she said. I heard, he said. You heard? Patricia texted me. I hope that's okay. I asked her to. Elise looked out the cab window at the lake, the last light going out of it. You asked Patricia to keep you updated. I wanted to know how it went. I didn't want to be in the way of it. She stopped. What? That's very you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Ruling comes in 4 days, he said. No matter how it goes. It's going to go the right way, she said. And she said it with a certainty she had earned by reading Dana Ferris's assessment 3 times and believing it. You don't know that. I know Dana, and I know what I read in that case file, and I know what kind of father Penny has. She paused. 4 days. For days, he said. The ruling came in on a Thursday afternoon, 3:46 p.m. Mountain Time. Sawyer was on a job site in Englewood, on his knees under a kitchen cabinet, when his phone lit up with Warren's number. He sat up, hit his head gently on the cabinet frame, barely felt it, and answered. Warren said 11 words and then stopped because he could hear the quality of silence on the other end of the line. The motion to relocate had been denied. Judge Priestley's written ruling cited, specifically, the supplementary evidence regarding the child's established community and educational continuity, the father's documented primary involvement in her care, and the insufficiency of the relocation's demonstrated benefit to the child's welfare when weighed against the disruption to a demonstrably stable parental bond. Sawyer sat under the half-finished kitchen cabinet for 63 seconds without moving. Then he said, "Thank you, Warren," and hung up and sat there in the dust and the wood shavings and the half-assembled lower cabinets of a stranger's kitchen in Englewood, Colorado, and he let himself feel the full weight of what had just lifted. He didn't cry. He was not a man who cried easily, but his hand, when he finally pressed it to his face and exhaled, was shaking, just slightly, just enough to be honest. He called Penny's school and left a message for her teacher asking that she be told her dad would pick her up today instead of the usual carpool. Then he stood up, told his crew he had to leave early, and drove to Aurora Elementary School and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes and watched the building like it was the most important building he had ever seen. He texted Elise one line, "She stays." The response came back in 11 seconds. "I know." Dana called me. "Sawyer, I'm so glad." He looked at those words for a while. Then he tucked his phone in his pocket and got out of the truck and walked toward the school entrance to wait for his daughter to come out. And while he waited, he leaned against the hood of his truck in the late afternoon light, arms crossed, watching the yellow buses pull in and the parents accumulate at the fence line, all of them in their various shapes of tired and hopeful and present, And he thought about what it was to fight for something with everything you had, money, time, sleep, the marrow of your nerves, and come out the other side with the thing still in your hands. He thought about how close it had been. He thought about how different the walk to this fence line would have felt if the answer had gone the other way. And he let himself feel the full weight of the alternative. Not the version where he was the hero of his own story, because he had had help, real help from real people, including one person he hadn't expected. He let it be complicated, the way real gratitude usually is. He let it include the parts that humbled him. The bell rang. Kids came pouring out. And then there was Penny, backpack bouncing, hair half escaped from its ponytail, already scanning the fence line with those dark, careful eyes. They found him. She broke into a run. Not a child's theatrical run, but the real kind, the kind driven by something true. And she hit him like a warm freight train, and he caught her and held on, and the schoolyard went on being exactly what it was. I knew it was going to be okay, Penny said, muffled into his shoulder. Yeah, he said. I prayed, she said. But also I just kind of knew. He held her tighter. How did you know? She pulled back just enough to look at him with that old in the eyes look she got sometimes. Because you don't give up. And also because the flight attendant seemed like someone who gets things done. Sawyer let out a breath that was as close to a laugh as he'd managed all day. Yeah, he said. She is. He took Penny to dinner that night. Her choice, which meant the Italian place on Colfax with the checkered tablecloths and the breadsticks she could eat until she was embarrassed about it. She had no idea yet about the hearing. He had told her only that he had some news to share over dinner, and she had been watching him with her tilted head look since he'd picked her up, trying to read him. He waited until after the breadsticks and before the main course, because pacing was important. The meeting with the adults, he said. Yeah, it went the right way. Penny stared at him. The right way means... You're staying in Denver, he said. You're staying here. With me. You're not moving anywhere. Penny did not make a dramatic sound. She did not burst into tears or throw her arms around him, though both of those things were somewhere in the room. What she did was put both her hands flat on the checkered tablecloth and look at them for a long moment, very still, and then look up at her father with an expression that was the most distilled version of who she was, clear-eyed and quiet, and old in the way that children who have carried real things are sometimes old. You did that, she said. It wasn't a question. I had help, he said. The flight attendant? He had never mentioned Elise to her since Chicago. Yeah, he said. Her. Penny nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was processing something that confirmed an existing theory. I knew she wasn't just a flight attendant, she said. Sawyer smiled. What made you think that? Her hands, Penny said. They were wrong for the job. Sawyer stared at his 9-year-old daughter. What? She said. You noticed too. I saw you looking. He laughed then, a real one, full, the kind he hadn't had in a while. It wasn't loud or showy, but it filled the table and the nearby space, and the checkered tablecloth absorbed it and held it. And Penny grinned at him with both rows of her teeth showing, and the Italian place on Colfax went on being exactly what it was, and outside the window, Denver moved through its evening. And for 37 consecutive minutes, Sawyer Holt did not press anything down. He flew to Chicago the first weekend in November. This time he had a window seat, and he looked at the Rockies going small below him, and he thought about how strange and specific and unplanned all of it had been. A rude man on an airplane, a woman whose hands were wrong for the job, a 9-year-old who noticed too much, a moment in an aisle when he'd simply said what needed saying because his father had told him once that the only thing that gives a bully permission is silence. The woman at the restaurant he walked into that Saturday evening was not wearing a navy blazer. She was in a dark green dress, and her hair was down, and she had a glass of wine in front of her, and she stood up when he walked in, and he noticed again, as he had in the Chicago Riverwalk lobby, that she had a quality of compression about her. of someone who had spent a long time taking up a certain kind of space and was still learning, perhaps, how to stop managing it. They ordered dinner and they talked for 4 hours about Tatum logistics and the reform plan, which she was 6 weeks into implementing. The early indicators, she said, were better than she'd hoped. About the bungalow kitchen in Englewood and what it felt like to restore something old without losing what made it worth restoring. About Penny's book with the girl who could hear trees. About the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being known only partially, from showing people the version of yourself that's easiest to manage for so long that you start to forget the version underneath. I did that for a long time, Elise said. She was on her second glass of wine. In the company. In my marriage, I was married for 4 years, it didn't hold. In the work. I got so good at being the version of me that the room needed that I sort of... She turned the wine glass slowly on the table. Misplaced the original. What happened on the planes, Sawyer said. The undercover thing. Did it help with that? She thought about it. More than I expected. She looked at him. You helped with that. I talked to a rude man on an airplane. You were completely yourself, she said. No performance. No calculation. You just were what you were. And it was enough. It was more than enough. She paused. I'd forgotten that was an option. Sawyer was quiet. He looked at her across the table. This woman who ran a billion-dollar company and had worked a service job to understand the people in it, who had gone 7 days being looked through and snapped at and still done the work, who had reached out to a stranger not for anything she could get, but for something she couldn't let go of. You know what I think, he said. Tell me. I think you've always known who you are, he said. I think you just got very good at not letting anyone else know, because it wasn't safe to. And I think somewhere along the way you started confusing those two things. She looked at him for a long time. Yeah, she said quietly. That's exactly it. The restaurant had thinned out around them. Their server had stopped hovering. Outside, Chicago moved through its November evening, the river dark and the bridges lit, the whole city doing its patient work of being itself. I want to ask you something, Elise said. Yeah. Would you bring Penny to Chicago sometime? She said it carefully, not casually, not overly weighted, just honestly. I'd like to take her to the aquarium and get her a Martinelli's from an actual cafe. Sawyer thought about this. He thought about his daughter in the taxi window, watching Chicago. He thought about the ending isn't the point. She'd love that, he said. And you? Elise asked. I'd love it too, he said. And he said it the way he said most true things, without preamble or apology. Just the fact offered plainly. Outside, November Chicago did what it did. Inside, 2 people sat in a restaurant long after dinner was finished and kept talking because the conversation had the quality of something that had been waiting a long time to happen, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to be anywhere else. That's where this story lives. Not in a moment on the airplane, though that moment mattered, and it set every subsequent thing in motion. Not in the boardroom or the courtroom or the hotel lobby, but here, in this restaurant, in the specific warmth of 2 people who have been through real things deciding, slowly and without fanfare, that they want to be known fully. By each other, by the people they're becoming, by the versions of themselves they nearly misplaced along the way. Sawyer Holt drove a cab at 37,000 feet, and it turned out he hadn't just offended a flight attendant. He'd reminded a CEO what it felt like to be seen. And she, in return, this woman he hadn't known for 6 weeks, whose hands had been wrong for the job, whose daughter's voice had said, "You look sad when you think nobody's looking." She had given him back something he hadn't known he'd been holding with both hands the whole time. The proof that doing the right, plain, unremarkable thing is sometimes exactly enough to change everything. If you're watching this, you've made it to the end. And if Penny's right, if the ending isn't the point, then what you just watched was really about the moments before it. The cold cup of coffee, The name tag that said Elise. The way a man turned around in his seat and said what needed saying because nobody else would. The way a little girl with dark eyebrows pressed her nose to a taxi window and watched a city go by. That's where it happened. Right there in the unremarkable middle of things. Just like most of the things that matter. If this story got to you, if some part of it felt real, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Crest Stories for new narratives every week. We'll see you in the next one.